He handled a really well-known SEC whistleblower case with a settlement that was a little bit more than $350 million against JP Morgan Chase, the bank.
Forensic investigation of my lifetime began at age 17 when I was investigating the murder of my father by Idi Amin, the president of Uganda.
Hello, hi. My name is Joe Piacentile, Dr. Joe. This is Dr. Joe's American Whistleblowers Podcast, and we talk to people from the whistleblowing field, doctors and lawyers and all kinds of interesting people about cases, whistleblowing cases involving money and the federal government and fraud on the federal government. If you're not aware, the original whistleblower statute was signed in 1864 by Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, towards the end of the war, there were people ripping off the Union Army, contractors. They would supply products that wouldn't work, and they were just like today. It was stealing millions of dollars. And Abraham Lincoln and the Congress decided that if a citizen or anybody could find this fraud and bring it to the attention of the government, there's a process you go through. The government then goes after the fraud with lawsuits and investigations and U.S. attorneys and FBI agents and all those good things. And when the case is settled, you get a share of the money. Now, that wasn't mandatory. It was not mandatory in 1864, but then in 1987, I believe, or 88, it became mandatory when Ronald Reagan became president. That program was very successful. It's called the False Claims Act. It was expanded. And then years later, the IRS opened up a whistleblower program. The SEC opened up a whistleblower program. And now we have a multiple of agencies that have whistleblower programs, and they're quite successful. I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine. We've known each other for 10 years now. His name is Ed Siedle. Ed has a fascinating background. He's going to tell you all about it. He is a friend. He is a forensic investment expert. He'll explain what that means. He had a column in Forbes for 12 years. He now has a Substack called Pension Warriors. So you can find him on Substack, Pension Warriors. His expertise is pension fraud, although he has done many other things. He worked for the SEC as a lawyer for about 10 years, and I know him as a famous whistleblower lawyer. He handled a really well-known SEC whistleblower case with a settlement that was a little bit more than $350 million against JP Morgan Chase, the bank. And he can tell you all about that case and his experience. He currently lives in Florida, but he does cases all over the country. So you can give him a call. And Ted, do you have a website you want to tell us about? And I can put that out there.
Yeah, I have the Siedle Law offices.
Siedle Law, and we spell that how exactly?
Siedle.
Siedle, Siedle Law. Ted, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background? Yeah, I know you have a fascinating personal story. I think you're going to share that with us, and that's really fascinating about your dad. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about you?
Well, thanks a lot, Joe. I've been involved in whistleblowing for the last 40, 50 years, actually. You could say that I'm a second-generation whistleblower.
Huh.
The first forensic investigation of my lifetime began at age 17 when I was investigating the murder of my father by Idi Amin, the president of Uganda. He disappeared when I was 17 and was involved with the CIA He was investigating a brutal murder of 500 Ugandan army soldiers in 1971, and he blew the whistle on Amin, and it was reported in the Newsweek magazine and throughout the country because he and another man, Nicholas Stroh, the heir to the Stroh Brewery, which many of your listeners may have heard of Stroh's beer, the two of them disappeared.
What year was that they disappeared, Ted?
1971.
All right, so everything happened in 71.
Since they disappeared, a commission of inquiry was held. The United States government demanded answers, and the Ugandan government said they knew nothing about it. But there was a commission of inquiry held, and in the end, the Ugandan government paid reparations to me and my brother for the murder, what was determined to be the murder of our father at that time. But his body was never found, never recovered. So I went back to Uganda in 1997 with the help of the CIA and State Department and the Uganda government, and I was able to meet the men who murdered him, who were in prison, and dig for his body.
So how were you able to meet the men that murdered him? There was a murder investigation, but under Idi Amin, you didn't know who murdered your dad. You just assumed he was murdered. You had no real information, correct?
Well, there was a commission of inquiry which issued a report within a year after my father disappeared. And the judge, a British judge who wrote the report, actually had to flee the country in the trunk of the American ambassador's car before he released his report, because the report concluded that certain people were likely to have been involved in the murder. That's as far as he was willing to go. So in 1972, a year after my father disappeared, there was a report naming people who were likely involved in the murder. And I was able to meet those people in 1997.
When did those people go to jail? If in 72, their name. So in 72, someone from the British government writes a report, but that report is so dangerous, he has to flee in the trunk of the ambassador's car. Now, did Idi Amin's government put him in prison, put those fellas in prison, or how did they end up in prison?
No, they were put in prison years later, like around 1980, after Amin had gone.
Well, that's my point. So
yeah, they continued to kill people. These same people continued to kill other people. So eventually, the new government tried them for murder.
So they were operatives of Idi Amin. Why did they your dad was investigating Idi Amin and this massacre of these 500 people, and then because of doing the investigation, he himself was killed, I guess, by Idi Amin's government.
Correct.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
And then Idi Amin is deposed, and after he's deposed, then they put these fellas in jail.
Yes.
Oh, all right. And then you worked with the new government, because there was that movie, Last King of Scotland, and that described that was a famous movie, it was a great movie, and that talked about Idi Amin. Now, your dad worked for the CIA or just with the CIA, or is that something you don't talk about much?
Well, let's say he at least worked with the CIA.
And your dad had a partner, correct?
Yes.
And they both were killed at the same time?
Yes.
All right. And then they never gave you any information, or you never were able to recover your dad's body, anything like that, correct?
Correct. But I actually just received a letter last week from the CIA telling me that the documents related to my father's murder will be released to me November 2026.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yes.
Now, why is that? Is there a time? Did it time out? Was there a time to the sealing of the documents, and that's now run out? Or did someone make a decision that the time has come for this information to come to light?
Well, I did a public records request a year ago, and then they just responded last week saying they estimate that they will get me the documents in November 2026. But after a certain period of time, 50 years or so, classified documents become declassified, and so more information is available. So let's just say with the passage of time and with stifling bureaucracy, I will finally be getting some documents.
So you have waited over 50 years for these documents. You
Yes.
started your investigation at age 17.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. How do you feel about that? I mean, 50 years is crazy time to wait. I mean, it must be what's going through your head, feeling, waiting for this.
Well, I've gotten a lot of information forensically over the years, and so I just feel, an obligation to my father to find out all that I can. But I've learned a lot over the last 50 years. I learned a lot going back to Uganda in 1997. And so it's just, to me, something that I have an obligation as his son to keep asking questions and to go as far as I can.
Take it as far as you can. Now, you wrote a book.
Yes.
You want to tell us about your book?
Yeah, I wrote a book called Buried Beneath the Tree in Africa, which is the journey to investigate my father's murder. And that came out last year, was in the New York Post, and was a top new release at Amazon in February of last year. And that tells the story. And in the beginning of the book, the president of Uganda wrote a preface to the book saying he would reopen the investigation this year. Whether he does that or not, we'll see. But he wrote a nice forward to the book as well. But yeah, that was, like I say, I'm a second generation whistleblower. My father blew the whistle on Idi Amin in 1971. I went to law school and went to work for the SEC in Washington, regulating the money management industry. And in 1983, and over the last 40 years, I have blown the whistle many, many times to the SEC. I put together a timeline for you to show some of the many, many cases. But I went from the SEC to being legal counsel to one of the largest money managers in the world, and where I discovered that the people there were engaged in illegal trading, the senior management. So I reported, my first SEC whistleblower case was in 1988. And as you alluded to, but what's important is that from 1988 to 2012, I related dozens of cases to the SEC of illegal activity I was aware of because of my work in the industry. But throughout that period, there was no whistleblower program.
Well, I was just about to ask you that. So you were blowing the whistle before there was any profit incentive to blow the whistle.
Right. Because I was in the industry and being made aware of violations of law. So I would report them to the SEC, to former colleagues. But there was no, financial reward. There was, it was just I was doing the right thing for my clients. But you and I, often hear there's this criticism, whistleblowers are only into doing this for the money. They're in it for the money.
We both know that it's not true.
Yeah, it's not true. And the fact that I was doing this for decades before there was even a potential for money, I think is a real testament that people who are involved in whistleblowing usually are there out of moral conviction. And if there's money to be made, great, but that's not the prime motivation.
When you were giving all this information to the SEC, what was your day job exactly? What were you doing? You were working in private sector. What were you doing?
Well, initially, after I left, I was legal counsel to a large money management firm. Then I started my own investment firm with funding from mutual benefit life insurance company. So for the next 16 years, I did not practice law. I was in the investment business, and that's why I was able to see so much.
And what years did you work for the SEC itself?
1983 to 1986.
Okay, so you worked from 83 to 86 at the SEC, and what was your job there when you worked there?
I was an attorney in what's called an attorney advisor in finance, which means you have 1 foot in law and 1 foot in finance. And in the division of investment management, which is the division that regulates the money management industry.
All right. And you call yourself a forensic investment expert. That's sort of a broad term, right? So kind of narrow that down for us. Your focus, is it just pensions, or what was your focus? And then I'd like to talk about the SEC case that was so famous that you worked on, this $350 million banking case. Do you want to kind of tell us what a forensic investment expert does, and tell us maybe about your JP Morgan case?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. By the way, I want to mention my book, Who Stole My Pension, which I wrote with my good friend Robert Kiyosaki, who you all may have heard of, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
I have that book, and I also have your book. It's called Who Stole My Pension?
Yes.
And I guess you're going to tell us all about pension fraud.
Yeah. Well,
I've had many conversations with you about pensions. It's very scary to talk to you about pensions.
Well, the reason I mention it right now is because in the book I start by saying, what is pension forensics? And I explain, it's kind of like the show CSI Miami, where the show opens where there's a dead body and the investigators come in, and their job is to determine whether the person died a natural death or was it due to unnatural causes, foul play.
Okay.
The work I do is I go in where there's a dead pension or a dead investment, and my job is to figure out, did it fail due to unforeseeable market forces, the market decline, it was just a bad investment, or was there foul play? Was there violations of law, conflicts of interest, hidden kickback schemes, whatever? And of course, in neither scenario, CSI Miami, or in my case, is nobody comes forward and says, I killed him with the candlestick in the drawing room or whatever. So you have to piece together what's happened, and you never have, or rarely have, access to all the documents. So you have to connect the dots. And the word forensics simply means that the work, the inquiry, the procedure is well enough based that it's acceptable in a court of law. So what I try to do in my forensic investigations of failed investments is to look at whatever information I can get, connect the dots, and come to an expert conclusion that will be acceptable in a court of law.
So I'm just curious, you say when a pension fails, I mean, I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to financial investigations. What does that mean when a pension fails? Do pensions often fail?
Well, thousands of pensions have been taken over by the PBGC, which is the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is a U.S. government agency. I've done the only forensic investigations ever of PBGC trusteed pensions.
Ted, what happens to the value of a pension when it fails? Do the pensioners, do the people who are members of the pension or the beneficiaries of the pension, do they get dollar for dollar? This agency that comes in and bails out, does it bail out the pension? Just describe what happens. We all kind of know about bank failures and the FDIC, but very few people know about pensions and the fund that you just mentioned that bails out pensions. What's that process look like when a pension fails and the person who that was his or her pension, what happens to those people?
Well, I worked on the only investigations of fraud and mismanagement in failed corporate pensions I've done, which involved the U.S. Airline Pilots Association pension fund. And then I also looked at United Airlines. But these are multi-billion-dollar plans. And, what happens is people don't get all the benefits they've been promised. They discover that the promises made are not promises kept. Some workers get all or most of their pension benefits. Other workers take a big haircut. So it's a big deal.
Did that happen in the case of U.S. Air or United? Did that happen to their pension?
Absolutely, yeah.
What
Because
happened?
in what the government bailout scheme really protects benefits up to like $50,000 pension, around a number around that. And of course, a pilot is going to get paid a lot more than that. So the pilots took the biggest hit when the flight attendants did not, but the pilots would have taken the biggest hit when the pension got taken over by the U.S. government.
Oh, it's funny. I just Googled about the failure of the pension, and it took me to your Substack.
I'm the only one who's investigating them and these failures. And we actually met with the senior staff at the PBGC almost 20 years ago, I think 2006, offering to do investigations of failed plans. And we said to them, look, when a pension plan fails, there should be an investigation done to identify anybody who may have contributed to the demise of the pension, and the government should go after them for money they've looted from the pension. But the government told us then that they did not have any interest in recovering that money, in part because they didn't know what they would do with it. They didn't know who the money would belong to, and that's a little complicated to go into. But basically, if the government recovered money from the U.S. Air pilots' pension plan, from a money manager who'd stolen money from the U.S. Air pilots' pension plan, would that money go to the U.S. Air pilots, or would that go into the government's coffers? They didn't know the answer to that. The law was unclear.
Well, what happened? I'm looking here. It was 2002 when the United Airlines pilots' pension plan was terminated as part of the bankruptcy. So what happens in bankruptcy to your pension plan? When your airline goes bankrupt, what happens to your pension plan?
Well, your pension plan, the assets are separate, and so there's some time between if a corporation declares bankruptcy, and the pension plan continued on. Well, I was involved, I think in 2012, they hired me to do the investigation.
And what did you get hired to do exactly? Like, what was your mission when they hired you, and who hired you exactly?
I was hired by a group called USAPA, which is the U.S. Air Pilots Association union.
All right. So the pilots union hired you to
Yes.
look at the pension plan and why it failed.
Yes. And who was to blame, and who might they recover money from.
And what was the, how long did it take you to do that investigation, and what were the results of that?
It took about, I think, 3 months for the initial investigation, and then we had to go a little deeper. I think the whole thing took about 6 months.
That's in the world of investigations, 6 months is pretty quick. And what did you find? Like, what happened?
Well, what we found was that Wall Street firms had, looted the pension, and that what we find, I've done over $1 trillion in forensic investigations of failed pensions, and what you find is when pensions are starting to fail, they go for the Hail Mary. They take the most outrageous bets ever, thinking that they're going to make up the money that they don't have. And so that's what you see is in the last 5 years of a pension's life, they get into all kinds of garbage and toxic investments. And so when the government takes over, it's a portfolio full of garbage. And so that was what we found there, and that's what we...
Now, when you find a portfolio full of garbage, the investment bankers or the people that that made those purchases on behalf of the pension fund, are they held liable? Do you go against them? Do they compensate the fund for this misconduct?
Almost never, but because it's forensic investigations of pension fraud are very rare. If the pension fund isn't your client, if the pension fund itself isn't suing, then it's much harder to get the documents and prove the fraud and have standing. So the answer to your question is almost never do people who rip off failed pensions get held accountable.
Now, does the SEC have any authority over pension funds?
Well, the SEC has authority over money managers, registered investment advisors.
Correct.
And so the pension funds hire hundreds or thousands of investment advisors to handle pieces of their portfolio. So like the state of New Jersey, for example, the pension fund there probably has over 1,000 SEC registered subcontractors that is actually managing the money, most of the money of the state pension.
Now, when these money managers commit wrongdoing, the SEC is responsible for. The SEC has authority to hold them responsible. No.
Yes.
And do they have insurance? I mean, it seems to me the pensioners trust the state of New Jersey to hire money managers that are competent and honest. When they're not competent and honest, is the state responsible, or does the SEC move in and hold the money managers responsible? How does the pensioner, who's just going about his or her job and trusting the state in this case, get made whole again if the pension collapses or if the pension loses most of its value? Who compensates the working man, the person that had this pension and relied on the pension?
Well, that's the problem, because at the state of New Jersey and all state and city and county pension funds, they do lose money on bad investments. They lose money as a result of fraud. But the people running the pension are politicians who are basically complicit. They don't want to go after the investment firms that have ripped them off, because many of these firms contribute to their political campaigns. So the common man, the participant in the fund, is kind of screwed, because when the common man loses money from his pension, the people overseeing his pension have no interest in going after it.
Sounds incredible, right? It just sounds. So all of these pensions that are out there, all these, tens of millions of working people, and these trillions of dollars in pensions, who's minding the store? Who's keeping an eye out that things aren't being, that there's no monkeying around behind the scenes? It's like a lot. Whenever I see, I've been doing whistleblowing for 30 years, right? I don't do pensions really. That's your space. But I just know when there's trillions of dollars involved, there's a lot of fraud. So where are the guardrails in the pension system? Where are the guardrails? How do we stop people from stealing pension money or mismanaging pension money? It's stealing, right? I mean, you're managing a pension, you're charging them fees, you're an investment advisor, you're hired by the pension, which is hired by the state, and you mismanage, you steal. Mismanagement means stealing in most cases, correct?
Yes.
So they're stealing.
Yeah.
So who's watching the shop? I mean, who's watching out for who's taking care of the pensioners? Who's guarding the bank?
Well, that's the question. And the answer is there's $6.5 trillion in state, local, and county pension funds in the United States. At $6.5 trillion. Those monies, state pension money, is not subject to ERISA, which is a comprehensive federal law that applies to corporate pensions. So state pensions are called public pensions, corporate pensions are called private pensions. And so
ERISA is a law that governs private company pensions.
Yeah, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, yes.
Right. No, I do ERISA cases. That part I know. But the public pensions, no one's watching. There's no agency other than the SEC, and they're not really involved.
Yeah, the ERISA has a huge loophole. The $6.5 trillion in public pensions are not subject to ERISA. which is this comprehensive federal law. Worse still, there is no comprehensive state law that governs these pensions. So every city, county, state pension fund is subject to different laws, state laws. And in most cases, Joe, there's no law at all. Like, can the pension fund of Toledo, Ohio, invest in Bitcoin? There's no answer. So there really is no regulation. I do these investigations, and I came up with a way of crowdfunding these investigations.
Yeah, that was my next question. Actually, I had circled here, crowdfunding. You launched the first ever crowdfunded forensic investigation of a state pension, and you did it on Kickstarter.
Right.
So you use crowdfunding, Kickstarter, to do an investigation against the Rhode Island Retired Teachers Association. Can you tell us about that? This seems wild. Why did you even think to start this? And how did you go about it? What made you think of crowdfunding of all things? And why Rhode Island versus some other? Why the Rhode Island Teachers Association? Tell us the story.
Well, it was really wild. In 2011 to 2012, the SEC was considering rules. This was related to the Jobs Act, or Jumpstart Our Jobs Act. I forget what the name of it was. But in 2011, 2012, the SEC was considering for the first time allow small businesses to raise equity money on the internet through a process known as crowdfunding. And so you could raise money if you wanted to start a limousine company. You could issue shares. The idea was that they were considering was to allow small businesses to sell equity in their businesses through the internet, through crowdfunding. But there was tremendous concern, as you can appreciate, that this would be used for fraud. And so there was a lot of delay in implementing these rules. And so when I heard about this, I thought, well, what if we used crowdfunding to not perpetrate fraud, but to actually investigate fraud? So that's what we came out with, the idea, and it was written up in Rolling Stone magazine and elsewhere. And the SEC actually called me, and they said that they had a study group, and they said, we were so concerned about crowdfunding being used to perpetrate fraud, it never occurred to us that crowdfunding could be used to combat fraud. And so that's how we got started in Rhode Island. And it was the forensic investigation of the $8 billion Rhode Island state retirement system, which included teachers, but included all state workers.
Now, what made you pick that one?
Well, there was a woman named Gina Raimondo had been elected to be the state treasurer. And of course, she went on to be Commerce Secretary under Joe Biden. But in 2011, she came out with what she said was pension reform, a way to fix all the state and local pension funds. And so her reform, Gina Raimondo's reform, was to cut the benefits that had been promised to teachers. And then what she didn't say was pay that money to Wall Street, hire hedge fund money managers for much, much more money. So what the part of the equation that she was not being honest about was, she said that if we cut the benefits, it'll make the pension more sustainable. But what she wasn't saying was she was taking that money and effectively doing a wealth transfer. Teacher pension benefits were being cut by 3%. Wall Street was getting the 3% in hedge fund fees. So that's what attracted me to the Rhode Island situation, was that this so-called crusader for pension reform was actually backed by Wall Street, and her mission was to secretly move money to Wall Street. The pension savings, if you will, were actually being spent on Wall Street. And that's what the investigation showed. And it predicted that the hedge fund gamble would fail spectacularly. And 5 years later, they abandoned it because it had...
Wait, 5 years later, what happened?
They dropped, the new treasurer came in and dropped the hedge fund gamble. He said he wanted to go back to basics and get away from this crazy gambling that the Gina Raimondo had initiated.
So what was the purpose of when Gina Raimondo, who's from Rhode Island, I'm looking here, that she was the treasurer of Rhode Island, the governor of Rhode Island, and then she became the United States Secretary of Commerce. This is the same person you're talking about. Her this Rhode Island teacher's pension they reduced the benefits to teachers 3%. All right, that's fine. But how is that reform for the teachers?
It wasn't. It was a lie.
They're getting less money, but how is it? How is that sold to them? I mean, what was the public face of that move?
Well, the public face was an austerity play. Look, we're going to tighten our belts. We're going to cut the benefits promised to teachers. And then that way the pension, which was, let's say, only most of these, by the way, Joe, the state, county, and city pensions across the country are on average about 70% funded, which means they only have 70 cents for every dollar.
Every dollar that they promise. Right.
Rhode Island was worse. It was, let's say, 60% at the time. So she said, if we tighten our belts, if the teachers tighten their belts, we cut the benefits, then instead of being 60% funded, we'll be, 80% funded. But that was the story that was being told to teachers.
Yeah, in 2011, she released a report called Truth in Numbers and advocated benefit cuts as a solution to the Rhode Island pension problems. So she cut them 3% to make the pension stronger, I guess, right? That was the concept. But where did that 3% really go? It went to bankers?
Yeah, the fees skyrocketed. The first thing I wrote about in Forbes about the Rhode Island situation was that I noticed that they were saying the fees of the pension were $10 million a year. I said, that can't possibly be right. The fees are more like $100 million a year. And within 90 days of my writing that, the pension fund changed their disclosure from 10 million to 80 million. And now it's 180 million. So Wall Street has got, the fees weren't being properly disclosed to the public. They upped the fee disclosure based on my, I always tell the story, from the sunny shores of Florida, I was able to peek at the Rhode Island pension plan and see something that apparently nobody in Rhode Island could see, which was that the fees made no sense.
And all this happened between 2011 and 2015, when she was the treasurer of Rhode Island. But all this money goes to Wall Street, and then she becomes governor in 2015.
With the largest campaign contributions in the history of Rhode Island. Her friends at Wall Street rewarded her, and it was a huge amount of spending went into getting her, and she didn't win the popular vote in either case,
Which is unusual because she's a Democrat, and this was a teacher's pension. And usually you associate teachers' unions with Democrats, and the Democrats are doing everything they can to help the teachers. What you're saying is between 2011 and 2015, the amounts paid to teachers were cut, and the amounts given to the bankers that manage these pension funds was raised. And then when the disclosures were made to the public, they said the fees were 10 million. In reality, the fees were much, much more. And then they came out and changed it and said the fees are 80 million. So what happens when that happens, when you catch people misrepresenting the fees on a pension plan in Rhode Island? What's the mechanism in Rhode Island to make those teachers whole again for all of this extra money paid? Did all of this money paid to the investment bankers Did they grow the wealth of the fund with all that money? I mean, the concept is I'm going to give more money to investment bankers, and they're so smart that they're going to create more wealth for the fund because they're taking money from the fund. So did they create a lot more wealth? Did they make great investments? And the people of Rhode Island and these teachers got more money because these investment bankers made more money? What happened to the fund?
Well, the fund tanked, and the teachers were screwed, and the Rhode Island teachers hate her to this day because the benefit cuts have gone on now for 13 years. And so basically, instead of, with the cost of living, not only have their benefits not increased, the value of their benefits they receive have decreased significantly. So let's say that $2,000 a month check you were getting, pension benefit, in 2012 may have been was worth $2,000, but today it's worth maybe $1,500.
And then she failed up by becoming Secretary of Commerce.
It reminds me of when I was in law school. I rode on a bus from Springfield, Massachusetts to Boston sitting next to a Jesuit priest. And he said to me, I'll never forget, he said, "Ted, there are people who have reputations and credentials well beyond their capabilities." That's Gina Raimondo, Rhodes Scholar, lawyer, but failed as a money manager, did a terrible job managing money before she got hired by the state, failed as state treasurer, and was noted as being the least popular governor in the United States. And then she found herself working with the Biden in the Biden cabinet. Before that, she was the Michael Bloomberg's campaign director in the leading up to the election. But eventually she ended up in the Biden administration. But
so all of that was in 2015. And then 2 years later, I just want to jump ahead because this is something really special. 2 years later, I think your JP Morgan Chase SEC case was on. Is that when it was unsealed, or was that when you filed it, or that's when it got paid? Can you tell us about this? Because you're well known in our space, in the whistleblower attorney space, for that JP Morgan case. That's what people know you best for. I mean, people of Rhode Island know about the retirement fund, but if you talk to lawyers in the whistleblower space, everybody knows that you were the JP Morgan lawyer, not the JP Morgan lawyer, the guy who blew the whistle on them. Can you tell us about the JP Morgan case?
Well, yeah, it's a very story of unlikely outcomes. In 2012, a colleague of mine named Chris Toby, he had contacted me. He was a board member of the $12 billion Kentucky state retirement system. He had found out that the state was paying kickbacks to some investment firms, that some investment firms were paying kickbacks. And so he reported it to the SEC. This is 2012. So he came to me, he said, "Ted, I'd like you to be my lawyer, my independent counsel. The pension fund will pay for you to be my independent counsel on this SEC whistleblower matter." And I said to him, with my unique genius, I said, "Chris, the SEC whistleblower program is never going to pay anybody anything." I said that this is just a waste of time. But I had a similar view when bottled water came out decades ago. Who would pay money for bottled water?
So your predictions are a little off sometimes.
3 years later, I got the largest award in history, $78 million, 30 from the CFTC and 48 million from the SEC. But my initial take was that this program was just going nowhere. And in his case, the pension fund was investigated by the SEC, but they didn't take any action at the end of their investigation. They should have. The pension fund now is still fighting lawsuits.
So that
Going
was the
back,
Kentucky pension plan.
right? The
Kentucky
State.
teachers or all Kentucky union workers? What?
It was all Kentucky state workers.
All state workers in Kentucky. And now, who was bribing who exactly? What was the allegation?
Well, the allegation was, in that case, was, I believe, that investment firms were paying influential intermediaries to get themselves hired. So it was
so people who had influence in Kentucky politics were getting paid by the investment firms to get on the list of firms that were managing X billion dollars of Kentucky pension money.
Yes.
Okay.
And by the way, the report I wrote in that case is public. Anybody who wants to look it up can look at it. All of the crowdfunded and investigations I do of state pensions are made public at the end of the investigation. And so there's about them online you can see. So anyhow, my initial prediction that the SEC whistleblower program would be a total waste of time was absolutely wrong.
So Chris Tobey was the whistleblower and you were the lawyer?
Yes.
Okay.
But then later, since I do a lot of investigations around the world, things come to my attention on my own, as opposed to having a client that I represent. JP Morgan case, I was the whistleblower and the whistleblower lawyer. And so in that case, there were conflicts of interest and hidden fees and the usual things that I look for. And I wrote about them in Forbes and also then turned it into an SEC whistleblower case.
On the Chris Tobey case, that settled and you got paid by the SEC for that case?
No, the Chris Tobey case, the SEC did not take any action. I got paid, but the pension fund paid me to be his independent counsel initially.
Right, but SEC looked at it and didn't do anything, but you think there was wrongdoing there?
Oh, there's no question there was wrongdoing there. It's just the SEC does not want to get involved in federal and state politics. You cannot get involved in state pension wrongdoing without stumbling into state politics. It's all what I call the politicization of the investment process. The decisions that are made at these state and local pensions are based on politics, the mayor, the governor. And so for the SEC to get involved, you're basically, it's got to be a really egregious situation. They do not want to get involved in state politics.
So would it be accurate to say that there's a level of corruption that's baked in to the political oversight of state pension funds?
Yeah, this is why on Wall Street, state pension funds are called the quote unquote dumbest investors in the room. And there's two reasons for that. One is, like we mentioned earlier, there's no federal regulation of what they do. So it's the Wild West. And Wall Street knows it. You can sell products to state pensions that you can't sell in the corporate pension area. And then the second thing is why this is such a hotbed of corruption. One is lack of regulation. The other one is that these state pension boards, city pension boards, county pension boards all consist of laymen who have no investment training at all. They're school teachers, firefighters, police, sanitation workers, politicians, union members. None of them, there's no requirement that they have any financial expertise.
So the people, right? So the people who are really getting the short end of the stick here are the hardworking blue-collar Kentucky people who work for the state and have a pension plan, and they're counting on that pension plan for their old age. And you're telling me that they turn it over to the trust of politicians. The Wall Street bankers think those politicians are the dumbest investors in the market, so they sell the worst financial products with the highest fees to these state pension funds, because the people who oversee the funds themselves aren't investment experts, but more like political hacks.
Yeah, which brings us to the Minnesota state pension investigation I just completed in September of 2024. In that case, I was hired by 20,000 school teachers in Minnesota. They had a Facebook group called Minnesota Educators for Pension Reform.
Okay.
And by the way, this is a new development that I've encouraged, is there are many pensions now have Facebook groups, and those Facebook groups are being better advocates for pension transparency and reform than any union has been for decades now. So the Facebook groups are doing the work to protect workers that unions used to do, but that they don't do when it comes to pensions. So they got together and last April 2024, did a crowdfunding to hire me to investigate the teacher pension fund. And so they raised the money within a month. And so we got started, I think, in May. The state freaked out. They sent emails around to all the state agencies saying that this investigation was going to undermine the public confidence in the state system. It has to be stopped. We can't allow this to happen. And amazingly, we got all those emails through a public records request. So I published them all, these warnings about.
I just want to get this straight. So now, Minnesota, you're saying you were hired by the teachers, by the Facebook group teachers, these teachers who were out for pension reform. They hire you. What month in 2024 does this all get started?
March or April
of 2024. The state immediately freaks out and starts sending emails out that you're going to undermine the entire system simply because you're doing an audit on behalf of the very people who pay into the pension system. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And who's the governor? Who's the governor of Minnesota at that point?
At that point is a fellow named Tim Walz.
That's what I thought.
Well known.
Yeah. Wait, so that's the same Tim Walz then who gets tapped to be the VP candidate, who's running around America talking about corruption and bad politics, but his state government tried to shut you down almost immediately for the crime of actually asking what happens to our money on behalf of the teachers.
Yeah, and ironically, there was
who support, by the way, the Democratic Party.
Yeah,
that's the irony here. That's what I do.
Same as in Rhode Island. Supposedly, the Democratic Party does well for teachers, workers. Gina Raimondo did. Tim Walz was in Minnesota. There was a quirk in the public records law, which said if you request information from the state about yourself, then they have to give it to you within 10 days. Usually when I ask for documents from these states, they stretch it out for years.
Right. God forbid you should ask for your own documents.
Yeah. So I asked for documents about myself, and within 10 days, we got these documents from the Attorney General, from the state auditor, from the pension board members saying we've got to stop this investigation. And this was, mind you, Joe, this was before the investigation had been funded. The first email says, wow, the group is trying to raise $75,000. They've already raised $26,000. We got to stop this before, they reach their goal. And fortunately, and the belief was,
oh, wait a second. In 2024, the Attorney General of Minnesota was Keith Ellison.
Here's what happened. So we get hired by the teachers to investigate the teacher retirement system, which has $28 billion in it. Well, it turned out that all the money in the state teachers pension fund was managed by the state pension fund, which is $156 $146 billion pension fund. And that the assets, there were no assets held in the name of the teacher fund. They were all being held in the name of the state fund. So bottom line is the $28 billion investigation of the teacher pension fund pivoted to become a investigation of the $146 billion state pension fund, which nobody knew this at the beginning of this project. And then it turns out that the state pension fund has 3 members of its board. Tim Walz is the chairman as governor. Keith Ellison was on the board as the attorney general. And then I think the state auditor was another person. But so next thing I know, I'm investigating Tim Walz. And then, much to all of our surprise, the report was ready to be issued, was completed in September, and it was in September. I think within the days of the report, Tim Walz was named as the VP candidate, and Tim Walz, when they showed his financial statements, they said, oh my God, this guy really doesn't have much other than his pension wealth. And he admitted he had never bought stock or bond in his entire life. So the chairman of a $146 billion pension fund was Tim
Had never
Walz.
bought a stock in his life.
Never. Knew absolutely nothing. And
Amazing.
one of the things we said in the report was that the fees were outrageously underreported. Wall Street was getting paid far more. And surprisingly, the pension fund and Tim Walz didn't say a word from September about this investigation, from September to January. No Minnesota media was told not to write about it, and not a single story was written about it, about the investigation in Minnesota media. It was in 2 articles appeared in the New York Post. It was on Fox News, but not a word about this was reported in the Minnesota media.
Because he was the nominee for vice president.
Yeah. And then we just learned that when they finalized their fiscal year-end statements, which was in late December 2024, they changed the numbers. They increased the fees, the disclosed fees by 400%, exactly what my report had said in September. They changed the numbers at the end of December to show a 400% increase. So in the world of financial reporting, a 5% change is regarded by lawyers as being material. A 400%, how do you not notice $350 million a year for 10 years, $3.5 billion?
And the attorney general and the governor, Keith Ellison and Tim Walz, are on the board that controls this. How many billions in this fund?
$146 billion.
So they control $146 billion, Minnesota's pension money. But the governor who controls this admitted he never bought a stock in his life. The only money he actually had was his own pension from Minnesota.
That, and I think his home, his assets were really, I think his pension in his home.
And his home. And before your audit, what were the fees that were listed in the public forward statements? What were the fees? You said it went up 400%. Where did it go from what to what?
It went from $84 million to $360 million.
So they were telling the public that the fees paid to manage this multi-billion-dollar fund were $84 million, but in reality, it was $360 million.
That's what they're saying now. My estimate is that it's about 3 times greater. It's over $1 billion. But we got them to go from $84 million.
Well, how does that happen? How can it? They're saying right now today it's 360 million. You're saying it's $1 billion. Why do you say that?
Because they're not counting what is called in the business performance fees. So these fund managers get paid 2% a year to manage the money, plus 20% of the profits.
It's a classic 2 and 20 model,
Yeah.
which everyone has. 2% management fees and 20% of what they call the ups, right?
Right. They're not counting.
They don't count the ups?
No, they don't count them. And that amounts to, billions and billions of dollars.
So wait, so they're in essence not telling the full story to the people of their state. Who oversees this? Is there a federal agency that oversees this conduct or this misconduct? Or in this case,
Well, yeah, who do you think it would be, Joe?
it should be the federal government, shouldn't it?
It turns out it's the Attorney General. We had to report the Attorney General to the Attorney General.
Wow.
My report was written and submitted to the FBI, the SEC, and the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. We requested a meeting with him. He said, "What do you want to meet about?" I said, "About this report." And then he canceled the meeting, refused to meet.
So what happens in this case where, all right, if an attorney general commits a blatant fraud, he would get investigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office. I mean, that's the mechanism for blatant frauds and crimes. In this case, let's just call it willful mismanagement or blind-eyed mismanagement, right? Or just a serious lack of transparency, correct? But is that a crime? Is it a crime to pay money managers $1 billion and turn around and report to the citizens of the state that you only paid a fraction of that? Is that a crime?
Well, that's the question. And then, what's interesting is one of the Pennsylvania State Pension misreported their performance results. And this is in the news now, is that it was brought to their attention a few years ago that they could lose their tax-exempt status for failing to file their accurate financial reports. And as you know, President Trump is now using that as leverage with Harvard, that Harvard could lose its tax-exempt status.
So who has tax-exempt status here?
The state pension. The gains in the state pension fund are not taxed.
Okay. All right. So and that's the federal government that sets the tax exemptions.
Yes.
So in theory, the federal government could use the same tactic they used with Harvard to a state that is mismanaging or poorly managing its pension fund.
Yes, and that happened in Pennsylvania just a couple of years ago. The lawyers for this Pennsylvania State Employees Retirement System said that this error that you've made is so serious you could lose your tax-exempt status. And that freaked everybody out because that would have, dire consequences on every teacher, the state's finances. But in Minnesota, the question is, they admitted in their financial statements that they had not historically over the last decade reported these fees. And then they said because it was not practicable, they couldn't do it on a timely basis. Suddenly, after my report was written, the impossible became possible. They did disclose some of the fees, but they're not disclosing all of them. They know from my report that there are more fees that they're not disclosing. So when does it become criminal? I don't know. It's like, you can say I didn't know for a decade, and then you can say, well, I knew, but I didn't disclose everything. And then, at what point does it become a criminal matter? At what point do you potentially lose your tax-exempt status?
Well, who is the current acting? I see that there was an acting attorney general of Minnesota, the U.S. attorney, rather. Who is the U.S. attorney in Minnesota now? Do we know?
I don't know.
But
we reported it to the attorney general, the state attorney general, the SEC.
But it's the state attorney general that's culpable here.
Right.
So you'd have to go up to the federal level for that state, which would be the U.S. attorney's office in that state.
Well, we went to the FBI.
They work for the U.S. attorney. They don't work for the Attorney General. They work for the U.S. Attorney.
Well, nothing more has happened on it since September. It's aside from the now disclosed that the fees are much higher. But that's the problem is that.
So all of the people that hired you, all they really get to find out is the truth about their funds, but nobody's held accountable really. And all that happens is that the paperwork, what the fund is telling the public about the fees becomes more accurate and more transparent.
Well, pensions, nothing in pension world happens overnight. You're talking about long-term. So now 6 months after the investigation is completed or whatever, so far, all that's happened is that the results of the investigation have been confirmed. The financial disclosures have been changed. The state auditor is supposedly considering a request for a special review, but it's early in the game. This is not something that gets resolved in 6 months.
But it creates transparency, which is always good, particularly in government. But what we really need, and what you sound like you're saying, is you really need more accountability, direct accountability. So if you have a state pension funds where the fees are not being disclosed to the people whose money it is by the politicians in charge, in the case of Minnesota, the governor and the attorney general, you come in, you do an audit, now everybody discloses, the disclosures become more real. People realize that they've been paying a lot more than they thought. They're still not reporting the ups, as you call it, the ups, the 20% fee. So in the case of Minnesota, you said they're reporting 300 million and really it's $1 billion.
Yeah.
So who gets fired? Who gets fired after this information comes out? Who pays the price? Who's accountable for, I don't want to call it misconduct. Let's call it careless conduct or willfulness to turn the other cheek or blind eye. But who gets held accountable for this?
Well, that's the problem, is who does get. The SEC doesn't want to get involved. I'm hoping that Trump's FBI will get involved in this matter. Because
technically, does the SEC have authority over these funds?
Absolutely.
So if they wanted to, the SEC could investigate these funds, could make a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who then have access to the FBI as their investigators, and they could investigate for fraudulent conduct, criminal conduct, which is how things happen. The SEC makes referrals to the U.S. attorneys and the FBI all the time.
Well, I'm hopeful that possibly the Trump administration will see this as an opportunity. This is the ultimate of disruptions. If you get in, and Trump has a well-deserved reputation as a disruptor, get in there and do what no other politician in the history of this country has been willing to do. Look at these state pensions. My investigations determine that the $6.5 trillion in these pensions would be double that amount, $13 trillion, had the money been prudently managed over a 30-year period of time.
Now, because this would go to Pam Bondi, right? She's the head of the Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. Is there an agency of the government, any agency that oversees state pensions? Is there any agency other than the SEC?
No.
All right. So in order for accountability to come down to these states, the SEC would have to work with Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice to create a task force to investigate state pension funds for, I would say, mismanagement and transparency. In the least, mismanagement and transparency. In the worst, criminal misconduct. But that would have to come from the federal government, because in the case of
Minnesota,
the the two top officials in the state are the ones who are in charge and who are overseeing this mismanagement.
Absolutely.
So the next
would
step is what? To see if the SEC under Donald Trump and the U.S. attorneys under Pam Bondi take an interest in, because there's billions and billions of dollars here. And by the way, some of the largest pension funds are held by the very people that the Democratic Party says that they represent for years: Teamsters, teachers. I mean, this is the vast majority of these people that you're talking about are teachers or Teamsters or the people that the Democratic Party embraced, but they're ripping off their pensions. They're allowing the pensions to be mismanaged.
Yeah, that's why I think it would be a real opportunity to get involved in this area, for the new administration to get involved. And because the savings, I proposed creating a Department of Pension Efficiency, otherwise known as DOPE.
Dope.
And DOPE, I wrote about this in Substack and created actually a logo for the agency.
That would be great.
But DOPE would have the simplest task of any efficiency organization in the world. You can fix public pensions by two simple things. One, require 100% transparency.
That's
and
one.
Two, put them in index funds, just as Warren Buffett is. Low-cost investments like index funds. Those two things alone, which can be done without hiring any staff. You simply say funds have to be 100% transparent. By being 100% transparent, you would eliminate all those sketchy investment deals.
Have you been able to meet with the Trump administration about this?
No, I've been contacted by some people involved in the administration, but not directly. But I think it's just a great save the country Doge is supposedly looking to save a couple of $1 trillion.
$2 trillion, yeah.
This would say 6.5 trillion, and it's not Ted Siedle saying it. It's Warren Buffett saying, okay, by investing money prudently over time,
So you could create $6.5 trillion more wealth for the American workers through their pension funds, simply by creating transparency and putting the money into index funds.
Yes. There's not a state pension in this country that indexes its money fully. And Warren Buffett has been telling them for at least the last 20 years that that's what they should be doing with the money. So basically, they think they're smarter than Warren Buffett. But if you look at the returns, any state, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Minnesota, they substantially underperform the index. And the thing that many people don't get is a pension fund, you judge a pension fund, let's say over a 30-year period, paying 1% in fees or 2% in fees a year more than you should over 30 years, let's say 2% a year over 30 years with compounding, is 100%. Your pension would be twice as big. Most people don't understand how compounding works and how just a simple 1% slippage will over time reduce the value of your retirement fund by 50%, just a 1%. So the fix is very easy, and it would save, I think in Minnesota, I calculated it would save, I think, $50,000 per taxpayer, which is, I think, more than the average standard household income.
Listen, whatever I can do to help you get this to the attention of the federal government, because you're talking trillions of dollars that Donald Trump and his administration could put back in the pockets of Teamsters and union members and teachers all across the United States by simply correctly managing their pension money, by bringing some transparency and a little Warren Buffett financial sanity to the way that their money's being invested. That's the takeaway message from all of this, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course, Dope would would create all this wealth. So like in Minnesota, if nothing else, the teachers in Minnesota now know that hundreds of millions a year that they are being told they can't, pension benefits for teachers can't be increased. And now they know why, because it's going to Wall Street. So they're armed with that information. I hope they'll be able to negotiate more effectively. But yeah, it's a big number, the amount of money that's going to Wall Street. And both parties feed from the Wall Street trough. But the first one that's willing to break from that and do this would result in massive savings.
Yeah, and just it would be a tremendous good thing to do for all of those working people out there. Give them their own money back. What a shocking concept, right? To manage their money properly.
Yeah, and you're also ferreting out fraud. By getting the money in fully transparent, high integrity index funds, you're putting the scamsters out of business.
The trouble when you say fraud, then that sort of invokes, now you've got to get involved with the lawyers and the Department of Justice. Even if you just got the behavior to change without indicting anybody or sending anybody to prison, you literally just got those two things pushed through, right? You create the Department of Pension Efficiency, DOPE. That's great. You become the DOPE czar. They should make you that DOPE czar. You get some laws passed that say transparency, and then you take the Warren Buffett mindset and put this money in index funds, and everybody will do better. The money will be better invested. It takes it away from the politicians, and it takes it away from the scamsters, as you say. And whoever does that is going to win the loyalty of all of those voters forever and ever. And really take the steam out of the sails of these parties that say, they tell you to your face that they're supporting Teamsters, they're supporting teachers, and they're saying that with, and then behind their backs, they're stealing all this money, and they're letting all this money go to big banks. It's wild. The longer I'm in this business, the worse it gets. The more you peel away, it's like that artichoke. You peel and you peel and you peel. It never ends, and it just gets worse and worse.
Well, those words are really true here at this moment, particularly, Joe, because at this point, 16 or 17 states are proposing for the first time ever to invest as much as 10% of state pension money in cryptocurrency.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a terrible idea. Cryptocurrency doesn't have any of the protections or transparency or compliance with law. I've been working with the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, FBI, CFPB, all these different about how cryptocurrency is being used to fund terrorism, sex trafficking, and money laundering. So to have state pension money invested in crypto would be an insane gamble. Ask any teacher, do you want your retirement safe? You want your retirement security dependent on a crypto bet?
Yeah, no, I have some crypto cases right now that we're involved in, and the numbers are mind-boggling. They're in the billions, and the conduct is unbelievable and almost untraceable, or the money can vanish so quickly, and it's therapy, and it's global, so the money can be in another continent in seconds and milliseconds, and billions can disappear with wallets opening and closing and being transferred. It's amazing. Listen, I want to say thank you. This has really been fascinating, and you're a fascinating man, and the work you do is important. I could go through a list of all of the cases that you've been involved in with the different pension funds, the police in Vermont. You've had investigations in Nashville, in Chattanooga, Shelby County, Texas, Tennessee. Oh my gosh, the list goes on. Florida, you're a busy guy and you've done some amazing work, and I thank you. I did want to ask you one last tidbit about your dad. You mentioned he worked with the CIA, and unfortunately, he was killed for his work. And then eventually, you found out, what had happened, and Idi Amin was deposed. And when he was deposed, but you showed me once when I was in your house something that belonged to your father, which I thought was fascinating. That they returned to you, that you got back. Can you tell us what that was?
Yeah. My father, when we lived, I grew up all over the world with my father, traveling to a lot of hot spots, political hot spots. And we lived in the Panama Canal zone in Panama when I was a kid. And in Panama, he had a solid gold belt buckle made with his initials carved on it, which hangs here on my wall in that case. But so he had that made when I was a kid, probably about 8 years old, and he always wore it. And then when he disappeared in Africa, because he disappeared, the United States Embassy sent people to our house in Africa to pack it up. And months later, or maybe it was a year later, this big wooden crate came from Africa of our belongings that had been packed by local people. And miraculously, to this day, I don't even remember how it happened. In that box was this little box with his solid gold belt buckle in it. And I thought, nobody stole it. I mean, somehow it got shipped. This wooden crate sat for a year in a warehouse in Uganda before the government would release it. So it's just really remarkable. And more interesting is, why wasn't he wearing it the day he was killed?
Right.
Yeah,
it almost makes you think that, sometimes when we're going into situations that are dangerous and we think our life is at risk, you've seen this scene in movies all the time. You take off your ring, you take off your wedding ring, you leave it for, so that if you don't come back, your wife and your kids have your belongings. It's almost as if your dad knew he was putting something at risk. And so he left the belt back in his room or back at your house. But, it's a blessing to have that memento of your father. It's got to be special for you. It's got to have a tremendous meaning for you,
It does. And it's only in the decades that have followed have I thought about what a miracle it was that you didn't wear it that day.
Yeah.
It didn't get stolen, that it got shipped in a box back. And this box was big, Joe. This box was, 6 feet tall and 6 feet long.
Could I ask what your dad's name was?
Robert Siedle.
Robert Siedle. May his memory be a blessing.
Thank you.
All right. Well, listen, my brother, thank you. Keep up the good work. Now, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, they search you online. Let's do that again. What's the name of your Substack and what's the name of your website?
The Substack is Pension Warriors by Edward Siedle, and the website would be Siedle Law Offices.
Siedle Law. Siedle is spelled how?
Siedle.
Siedle Law. All right. And this is American Whistleblower. Our website is Whistleblowers International. We do cases all over the world. But listen, thank you. We've known each other a long time, and I hope we know each other a lot longer. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you.